recording. As a reminder, if you turn on your camera or if you say anything in the meeting, it'll be recorded. So it's going to be on YouTube. So act accordingly, whatever that means. Basically, don't turn your camera on if that's the problem for you. We will, my aim is to sort of speed through the changes, not speed, but go through the changes fairly rapidly and then do questions at the end. I think there is a fair likelihood we'll do this in less than an hour, but I can't say 100%. And yeah, I think that's basically it. So hold questions if you can, and then we'll just go through them one by one. So thanks to everybody for coming. First off, I appreciate it. I know everybody's busy and you have a lot on your plates, even without giant annual reports to fill out. I also really appreciate that you're willing to do this annual report. I know it's a pretty big undertaking, and I know that you have a million other things to take care of at any given moment. So I appreciate that everybody is willing to spend their time on it. And anything that we can do to make it a tiny bit easier, I'm happy to do. So that's the biggest takeaway is if you have questions at any point when you're working on the report, do not hesitate to get in touch. Don't slog through it and then get in touch. Just get in touch. Email me, call me, whatever, and we'll figure out what the situation is. So yeah, okay. So you all know what the annual report is, but it's basically a statistical view of a year in the life of the library, everything that we track, which is most of the easily quantifiable things, and a few that are harder to quantify. But yeah, so it's a mesh of questions that IMLS asks and questions that the state asks. The data gets submitted to IMLS when it's done, and then we publish what we've come up with as well for all libraries who participate in the program, in the report. So I'm not going to go through the whole everything there's happening because you all know what the report is. So we're just going to jump to changes. Hold on one sec. Okay. Okay, let's see. Nope, that was the right one. Okay, so these are the big changes for 2022. First off, you know what? Before we say changes, I'm going to talk about timelines because we, as you know, we're a little bit late this year. We were working on the report and ended up doing some more significant changes, particularly to the language, not as much to the questions. But because of that, that took longer than we envisioned. So that's why we're here right now and not last year. We started in November, so we're a little bit late on that front, later than last year. I can't tell you when the submission window is going to open yet. It's in the hands of our vendor, but they have to put it together and put the updates in. They're also working with 24 other states, give or take, at the same time. So we'll let you know as soon as we know. My kind of guess is it's going to be late January, maybe beginning of February, into March. So it's probably going to be a 6-week window with a 2-week extension at the end. But we'll know more relatively soon, and as soon as we do know, we'll let people know. But you can always start gathering your data as soon as your fiscal year ends. You can start jumping on that, so you're ready once the thing gets going. But changes for this year. First off, we used to have you previously you would enter a -1 for data that you didn't have, the data that was not available. We've working with our vendor, we discovered that -1s are problematic for the system because sometimes they get added into -2s and -3s, and they make all this weird math happen. So now we want people to write NA for not available in this case. So that's anything where the number is not available, and that is what I guess I'll say about that is that what am I trying to say? Anything that you don't have the number cannot be gathered. Feel free to put that in. I'm not going to come and complain because you have a couple of those in there. So if there's data that you don't have, just do that. Definitely don't feel like you need to create a number if the number is not available. Just put NA and we're good. There's only a couple of things that are so crucial that I will come back and be like, we really need to know your tax support from the town, or we really need to know your number of borrowers. But everything else, if you have NA, that's fine. Okay, thing number 2, and this is the biggest or the most apparent one. For all of our federal questions, which are about half of our questions, we changed the language to match the federal definitions. The language, you will note, is going to be more detailed and longer. So we've done this so that we get, in the hope that we get more consistent answers with other states by using the same language that is there. Not some states use it, and many states use it. Some states do not use it, but we are using the federal language for these going forward. So you notice they're longer. The questions are still the same. They're asking the same thing. We've been aiming for that all throughout, but the wording will be different. So, and longer. Because of that, the report itself is going to look longer, even though there are not that many more questions. So that's another thing to prepare yourself for. Okay, so now I'm getting into questions that we've actually added or changed. And I will say, we know that when we add a question or change a question right now, you didn't have any warning. You didn't know that you were collecting it a year ago, or in some cases 2 years ago, and we totally know that. So if this is a number you don't have available, it goes double for this. Just put NA. We don't know it because we weren't tracking it because you only just told us about it. That's totally fine. We will never give you any grief about that. You shouldn't feel like you have to go and do some elaborate forensic Excel work here to figure out this number. Just put in NA, that's fine. We use the approach where we just put it in the report, knowing that the first couple of years might be fuzzy. So the things that we have added or changed. I'm going to go into these in more detail in a second, but the quick summary is staffing. We added one question that asks how many permanent paid staff you have, because we knew hours, but we never knew how many staff. So 2, facilities. We added a chunk of facilities questions. These are ones that you'll probably have to think about once, and then future years you'll basically be repeating what you have. But we'll talk about them. There are about when the building was built, some qualitative questions about how well your building is working for you, and then a couple of questions about your meeting room, if you have one, and who owns your building. So these you might have to think about them once, but hopefully going forward, you won't have to do as much. Revenue. We've moved a couple things around in revenue. We are asking how many, what your total amount of late fines that you've collected are. We've updated the way that we track in-kind donations to, I think, hopefully be a little bit easier. And the question about transfers, we've removed that. It's not in there anymore. Expenditures. And again, we're going to go through these in detail in a sec. I just want to give you a quick summary. Expenditures. We've broken out questions about programming expenses, and we've broken other expenses also to include building, technology, and other. We recognize you may not have those numbers, but we think right now, previously, other is such a catch-all that it doesn't really tell anybody anything. So we're hoping that where people are able to break it down, it'll give a much better answer. Library collections. We've added a teen category into these because we weren't asking it before, but it's a number that in theory should be available to people, and I think might give more information than we were getting before. Just breaking in before, young adult was generally getting lumped into adult, and so it makes both of the numbers better than they were. Services. We also added teen young adult to physical circulation. Same deal. We know that might not be available retroactively, but we think that's a useful one. We've broken down the downloadable circulation into a number of different categories. So I'll talk about that when we get there. And then final questions, we re-added the old final question about what's new, and we added a question about how to share feedback with us about the report, basically, about how it worked and how we might make it better. So jumping ahead. Okay, so this is in more detail. We talked about NA. Basically, we want to do NA instead of -1. If you slip up, we'll catch it. It'll be fine. But just in general, it was sometimes doing strange things to the math. Here's an example of federal language. This is the first one, name of the library. So you'll see we were asking something a little bit more succinct, but they want to sort of cover all the bases. So here it is. The federal language will be in red. At least that's what we're aiming to do. And then in some cases, there's something that says Vermont guidance right after it. And it says either things that are specific to Vermont or things where we think the definition isn't absolutely clear, so a little more information is helpful. But as I said before, the questions are fundamentally the same. They're still asking the same things. They just phrase it differently, and in a longer way. So let's move from there. Okay, so now we're going to go through the things that are changing. Facilities. So what we're asking is, and this I'll say is because we don't know it. We've asked a couple of things in surveys about buildings lately to inform as we move forward on some of the capital possible capital grants, but we don't have a lot of kind of coherent information about this. So what we're asking is, when was your building originally built? When was it first built? When was the last major addition, if ever? And when was the last major refresh? A refresh is like paint and carpeting and things like that, things that don't affect the footprint at all. And so we just want when it was. And someone asked us, we don't care when the building was. If you have a 200-year-old building that was only been a library for 60 years, we care about when the building was built. It's really, these are structural questions about what shape the building might be in and what kind of things you are fighting with in terms of maintenance. So those 3 questions. Next is, and these are the qualitative ones. How does the size of the building meet your current needs, and how does the condition of the building meet your current needs? It's a qualitative thing from like excellent to poor. So just think about it, and we're happy to give back and forth if you're like, is it average or poor? I'm not sure. We can discuss. But basically, so you put that, and then there's a field for how are our services limited? Oh, we can't do programming because of X, or we have an issue with Y. And that's free form, that you can write as much as you want in those fields. So we're asking how your size and conditions meet the current needs. Then we ask about if you have a meeting room, how many people fit in the meeting room, and can the public use the meeting room for non-library programs? And then lastly, we're asking if the library building, that's not clear. The library building, is it owned by the municipality? Is it owned by the library? Is it owned by a third party? And then if it's not owned by the library, is it leased by the library? We know that this might get complicated because some libraries have somewhat complicated sort of ownership models, but do your best. And if you have questions about how you should be answering, just let me know. Okay, so that's facilities. Revenue. Did I miss staffing? No, I didn't. Okay, so I think I skipped staffing. The staffing question is, how many staff do you have that paid staff? Doesn't count volunteers. It does count people who are budgeted but are not paid. It does not count substitutes. We want people who are generally there every week that they're not on vacation. And it's just a number, so 1 or 8 or whatever, because we know the total number of hours of staff, but we have no idea how many actual staff that means. Okay, so next, revenue. So for revenue, the big ones that we have changed are we're asking about we're asking about how much money you make from late fines. If any. A lot of the libraries don't charge late fines. We're only asking about late fines, not material replacement or anything else like that, just traditional late fines. We want to, we've already asked yes, no, whether you do it, but we also want to know how much you make from it, if you can break that out. The other thing that we're asking, changing up, is we used to have in-kind donations, and it was sort of a free form. You just put in a box and said, plowing, and then you estimated how much money you were getting with plowing. You were donate sort of in kind, how much it would have cost. We decided that was not great, wasn't working great. It wasn't a super useful information. So now this time we're trying a bunch of check boxes, yes, nos, and it's basically, do you get the service provided to the library without paying for it? And there's a list of them. Maintenance, repair, utilities, landscaping, cleaning, garbage collections item, or professional. And then it's broken into 2 categories, which is 1, the municipality, if you work with them, and then somebody else. So these are just yes, no's. We don't need any numbers. And hopefully that will make this part a little bit easier and easier to compare. Lastly, for revenues, we've gotten rid of the transfer question. Transfers used to be interest that you made, anything that was basically coming out of savings or endowments or something else like that. This was making it so I think this was originally put there so that things added up better, so you could see where all the income was coming from, but it meant that we were answering some of the federal questions sort of incorrectly. So that question is now gone. What you should be doing is interest that you're getting from an endowment or a savings account or anything like that should go in other income. But principal, if you were spending principal out of your endowment or savings account or what have you, it doesn't get listed on the report at all because you already earned it some other time. So it shouldn't be there. That one could be complicated, so I'm happy to answer any questions about that, but we're hopeful that it will actually make things less complicated going forward. Okay, hopping ahead. Expenditures. Okay, things we're doing with expenditures. We basically, expenditures have previously were in collections, big bucket, employee costs, salaries and benefits, and everything else. It was just everything else was put in a bucket. So we've decided to try to break out everything else so it's a little more useful. So we've broken it into one, programming costs. Programming costs, and we ask for them by age if you can break them out by age, and if you can't, there's a total, so that's fine. This is things like presenters, equipment that you buy, supplies. It is not staff time. It is any of the other three, but not staff time. So that's one thing. Other expenses is we've also tried to break out building expenses, technology expenses, and other, which is at this point anything left. So again, those may be numbers that might be challenging to get, but we think we wanted to try at least. Where possible, there may be numbers that the town has. If you have a town, if your building is a town building, that go into building operations. If you can get those, that's great. We would love to include those, even if they are not literally technically listed in your budget, but we know that could be challenging. So, and then finally, grant project expenses are no longer listed separately. We know that in some cases people might need to track them that way, and we can have a back and forth on that. But before they were listed as their own thing, and now we would like them to go wherever they belong. Like if the grant was in programming, it should go in programming. If the grant was for collections, it should just go in collections and not be separated into a different thing. Okay. Services. The big one with services is that we have added teen young adult to the downloadable circulation. Sorry, to regular checkouts. But then also downloadable circulation was just one number before. It was what's your downloadable circ. And then but now we are trying to break it into both by age and by type, ebook and audiobook. Like many places on the survey, there are options to, if you don't have the number, you can just put in a total. And that's particularly true this year, where you didn't know that we were going to ask this. So let's see. Other changes. Okay, right at the end, previously, we skipped it last year, but previous years we had a question that's, what's new? What successes have you had? What have you accomplished? What do you want to talk about? And it's basically a free form. It can be 3 words. It can be 10 paragraphs, whatever you want. And it is, just clarifying that, it is intended to basically be about about 2022, not necessarily a reporting period. But you can go further back if you want to when you're explaining things, if it tells the story. Also worth pointing out, that stuff, whatever goes in here is going to be published. I mean, not published. It's going to be made publicly available afterwards. So don't write anything that you don't want going out in the world. And that is basically a super lightning version of the changes. I'm going to slip back so we have them all here. And now we're going to do questions. So you can either put them in the chat, you can raise your hand, you can just unmute yourself and ask. I think we have at least one question in the chat, so I'm going to start with that one. Oh, two. Okay. Okay. First off, Corey asks, if the building expenses aren't in your budget, how does that impact the reconciliation between revenue and expenses that the report does? That's a great question. So ideally, that's a good point. Ideally, if something is in one, it should be in the other, if that's a possibility. So if you have a number that, for example, that the town is providing in building maintenance, they can break out for your building, and that's one of the things that's important to clarify. If it's just this is what they spend on buildings, I don't know that you're going to get that specific number. But if you know exactly how much is going to go into your building, that's great. That should be revenue and expenses. So for revenue, that would be under tax support for the town. Does that make sense on that, Corey? If so, it's both. They're both sides are if possible. If you have the number coming into expenses, I would try to put it into revenue. And if you have trouble, if you have questions about where it should go in revenue, let me know.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm just going to chime in. Wouldn't it be in the in-kind donation where it's now just a checkbox and you don't actually put a number, I guess?
So basically the in-kind is if there's not a way, if there's not a number anywhere. If there is a number that is available from basically the municipality, I think is the case where the budget is being spent, then we'd like to see it if possible. But in many cases that won't be possible. And so that's fine. And you can just you can list it under in kind. But if there's somewhere in the town's accounting that can break out that number, then we'd love to see the actual number.
And you want that number then in our revenue also?
Yes, ideally. And definitely, this is new, so definitely ask if you get to a certain point and it seems like that's weird or not working the way that you would expect. Does that make ballpark sense?
Yeah, that's good enough for now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Definitely feel free to follow up on that. Okay, so I'm going to run through the chat ones and then we're going to do in-person ones.
Josh, I can't find the chat. This is Debbie Roederer. I can't find the chat button, but I did raise my hand.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So that means is I should be reading the chat questions. So that because
yeah, but I can't write in the chat box.
No. Sorry, no. I will definitely. I'm going to run through the chats and then we're going to do the in-person ones. So I will definitely.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure. Yes.
We don't own the land. Technically, the land that the library sits on is owned by the school. And so we pay, it's some kind of Act 60 smoke and mirrors for the town.
Gotcha.
But they charge us, like $29,000 a year for land rental. So where would that go?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'm going to write it down, and I don't actually have a good answer for you in that case.
Okay.
But
I can lump it into other, which is where it's always gone.
I think other is probably where it's going to end up, but that is I had not thought about that one previously. If I come up with a different answer, I will let you know, but I think other is probably where that's going to end up living.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I ask another question about collections?
Yeah, totally.
If you have Hoopla and you have downloadable TV and movies and all that stuff, is there a section in the collections?
Yeah, so
circulation?
Yes, and Dana at Ilsley also pointed out that we had sort of mixed messages on that. So what we are going to need to add another question because it clearly I just glossed over that and didn't include something. So I think we're going to add an additional question that is other, which is anything that is not an ebook or audiobook. So either Hoopla or Canopy, anything on that model of service. Or comics as well, things that are not in that are not ebooks or audiobooks, but are still coming through that model. But the question isn't in right now, so I'm going to have to add it before we start, and I'll share our information once we have that.
Thank you.
Thank you, but thanks for bringing that up. Okay, I'm going to do some of the chat questions. So I'm going to read Corey's chat question first off, because in case for anybody who doesn't have the one that we just answered, which is if the expenses like building operations aren't in our budget, how does that impact the reconciliation between revenue and expenses the report does? And so my hope is that ideally you'll be able to put it in both ends of the both in income and expense if the number is available. Marika Quichi asks, does Overdrive Marketplace provide the age-related breakdowns on and audiobooks? Yes, it does. I had to dig in a little bit to find it, but it is in there. And I think that if you're doing an annual number, depending on your process, if you're doing an annual number, it's going to be fairly straightforward. You can probably do it in about, because you'll just have to run it a couple different times. If you do them in monthly numbers, you can think about whether it's worth it for you to do it monthly because it's a little bit more work. But they are definitely available in there. And age-related, I should point out, is based on the, in this case, it's based on the item. So obviously we don't care how old the person who checks it out is. We only care what the item is. So so it's just based on whatever it's set in the ILS or in Overdrive. Marie asks the same thing. Yes, and I'm happy to walk through it because I had to pull those numbers for our the state Overdrive consortium that does not exist at this point, that became Palace. So I can walk you through how that would work. Dana has a few questions, which she shared with me ahead of time. So first question is, should the amount of tax support included for include funds budgeted for capital improvements? And no, we would like, if you know it's for capital, we would like it to go into capital revenue, which is the category right after normal revenue. The capital revenue is broken into local revenue, state revenue, federal revenue, and other revenue. So if you know it's for capital, ideally you could put it in there, even if it's for a project that is not happening this year. That's where we'd like that to go. Can the Department of Libraries provide the number of state-provided online databases? That should be, once the report is up and running, that should be filled in automatically. And the number is, for this one, is going to be 51. It will actually be changing a little bit with Gale modifying their resources, but it should fill in by default, so you shouldn't have to fill that in. Next, well, so you're pointing out the same thing that we just talked about, which is I specifically referenced Canopy, but then don't have anywhere to put the Canopy data because we've specified by ebooks and audiobooks. So we're going to fix that. We're going to add a question that is a catch-all for everything else, and that will ultimately be all added up at the end. But I'll share what that looks like with everybody who's participating in the report once that we get it finalized. But it should just be one single one. We're not going to break it out anymore. No more granular than that. Just everything else. And then Dana also asked in the COVID pandemic question section, are these questions about the pandemic as a whole? So the pandemic questions, as a reminder, there's a bunch of yes/nos there at the very end of the report. They basically are like, did you ever close because of the pandemic? Did you increase your Wi-Fi offerings because of the pandemic? So I had to clarify this with IMLS. They want, these questions are about their current reporting period, though they say they aren't because that's the way that the definitions are written. So we'll have to clarify that in the report. But they're just interested in the current fiscal year. And I will say these are the last year for the pandemic questions. They are taking them away for next year, but this year they still had them. So they were still asking them. Yeah, so it's only for the current reporting period.
Thanks so much, Josh, for answering all of those. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for running them by me ahead of time, because in that case, I was not clear on the answer. But any clarification on any of those for you, Dana?
No, that's perfect. That's really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so we're going to do the other chat ones. Actually, yeah, no, we'll hop through the chat ones, and then if anybody else has other questions, they can keep chatting or just put their hand up or shout out. Marie asks questions about in-kind donations. We pay for some of our utilities, phone and internet, but the town pays for the rest. So would I check that off or not? That's a good question. So I think if you're getting anything that is covered that is not happening in your budget, I would count that, even if you're partially paying for it. Does that make sense? If you think of a case where yeah, Marie, does that make sense? Sorry.
Kind of. I mean, I guess is that basically saying if the town is paying for any of those as an in-kind service, then we check it off as that category? Is that what you're?
Yeah, well, but I think you're getting at a good point though, because it might be deceptive, because it might suggest that you've gotten a free ride for that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to think about that. What if we pay for half? Okay. Let's consider that. We'll revisit that, and I'll contemplate it and see if we can come up with a better answer on that. My tentative answer is to enter it, but I think that bears a little more thought. Okay. Okay, so Jeanette asks, if money is fundraised in one fiscal year for purchases made in the next fiscal year that isn't interest income, so that 10,000 of spending isn't reported. Sorry, Jeanette, would you hop in if you don't mind?
Sure. You'd mentioned about if you're taking money that was raised, that was from a different year, you only take it if it's interest, not if it's capital. But in a case like this, you're actually taking all the capital for the purchase.
Gotcha. Yeah. So if okay,
I mean, just to give you an example.
Yes,
last
please.
year
Thank you.
We did in our past fiscal year, we did a fundraiser and raised $10,000 to buy things for our library of things. Those expenditures spent all that money in this fiscal year.
Gotcha.
So we're going to have a lot of expenses not showing where the money came from.
Gotcha. Okay. So, in general, so going forward, and I think this is something that wasn't always structured this way. Going forward, we would like the income to be described the year it happens and the expenses to be described the year they happen, even if that means that things don't match up entirely, even if it looks like there's a gap. If there is income that was not listed in a previous year, that you got in a previous year, we should talk about that, where to put that. But in general, our hope would be that you would income would happen the year that it happens. Expense would happen the year that it happens, even if it looks like there is a disconnect between the two. Does that make sense?
So
what do you do with the 10,000? Is that maybe? So if it wasn't in last year's, if you would sort of set it aside, if it has never been reported on the report, I guess is what I'm saying, then I would just include it this year as though it were income. But if it was in last year's report, then I would leave it off.
Okay, probably should have been. It's why library budgets, or at least our library budget, never makes sense, because it never balances, even though we're not bouncing checks.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's and there are always pieces of it that we like this that we don't ask about, or things that can come in certain ways, or particularly come in through the town that don't ever hit your budget, and we might not ask about. So it is just inherent. I think that my sense is the department at one point was really looking for these was doing what it could to make it so the number balanced out, and I think that is not is a hopeless quest in some ways, because I think I think knowing that they don't have to balance, that it doesn't mean that somebody is like underfunded. That it just means that's the way it is. I think is our approach going forward.
Good. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. Christine from Whitingham has a facilities question, and it's a good one, about the year built question. Our building is an addition specifically added to our municipal building to house the library. Do we use the year that the addition was built or the main building? That's a great question. I had not thought about it at all before. I would say we could talk about it further. I think that.
Hey, Josh, I have an idea.
Yeah, I would love an idea. Thanks, Tom.
How about the oldest part of the building that the library uses?
I like that. I think that's good. And because we don't, I mean, at the end of the day, to some degree, we don't care about the municipal part of the building, really.
No.
We just care about how your building works for you. And I think I'm going to write that down. Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. I think that's a good approach.
I mean, does that make sense? I would think that would make sense, right? Even if it's a small percentage of the building, right?
I think that would work with me. Christine, feel free to chime in if that sounds like it is a good or terrible approach to you.
Hi, Josh. Yeah, I guess that's fine. I mean, the main building the main library is in the addition part that was built for the library. We use other parts of the building, such as like the community room we use for events and meetings and things. And that's part of the original building. So.
Gotcha. We might have to, let's think about that. We may end up having to, wanting to, in that case, because you are using part of the, you could just put put the original year in the other one, but let's have a back and forth on that just to make sure that we can nail it down.
Okay, thank you.
But thank you. That's a good question. And if other people, obviously, if you have questions about anything, you should get in touch. But if other people have questions that are similar to that, let me know, and we can make sure that we're doing this in a way that kind of works for people. Barbara from Windsor asks, we are currently having a lift installed into our building footprint and having some other accessibility improvements. Does that count as a refresh? Yeah, a lift is such a big thing. That's a good question. I think it is, and I should have contemplated lifts and elevators separately, probably, because that's the thing that comes up so often. How about tentatively we'll say that is a refresh, because it is sort of a significant construction, but not a full addition. I might come back to that. Is a lift let's come back to that. But I think my tentative, I'm going to we'll think about that and get back to you on that. Sorry, Barbara. Paula asks, if the town provides us the building for $1 per year, is there an in-kind donation to cover building rental? There is not. Let's see, might get broken out for, in a sense, you're leasing the building, I guess. So there's a spot under facilities that will ask if you lease the building, and I think that might be the best place for that. But also, I think in general, if you're thinking of things that are happening that it seems like the report doesn't have a good answer for, let me know, and we can always try to clarify them for next year, even if we can't get them solved for this year. Okay, Marie has a similar question about refreshes. What if your building is in an old but renovated part of the building? A lift was added, etc. So I would call that more than a refresh, but there is no addition. Addition, we tried to scale it. So building a building, that's pretty straightforward. Addition, we were trying to think of significant structural change. It didn't necessarily need to be a change in the footprint, but a significant structural work. So let's see. So if there, again, a lift is sort of on the edge case, but if there was structural work besides the lift, I think that would be that would be a renovation. So that's another thing we can keep talking about. We may need to just hash out these kind of narrow building questions as a group. But let me write down that we're working on that with you to clarify. Yeah. So yeah. So let's clarify. We'll narrow down our bucket so it's very clear which of those everybody's going into. And then Corey asks, just to clarify in the budget reconciliation piece, that was a state, not a federal requirement. I recall having to explain the discrepancy if it was more than a certain percentage and thought that was a federal thing. Yes. So that's a great question. So the answer is both, kind of. So there will be a question if there is a significant discrepancy on the federal side. It will ask you to explain it. That's true. There was a sort of more developed part, or is a sort of more developed part that was on our side, where it was about the discrepancy in it would call out sort of the percentage that was happening there. So it's still there to some degree, but yes, so it is still there. There is still a question. You will still need to put in an edit check if it thinks that there's a disparity, but it's not something that we are highlighting, I would say, because we recognize that there is invariably a good reason for it, and it's almost always bookkeeping and is not it doesn't usually present some weirdness that is going on. So you may need to answer it in the edit check, but it's, again, not something we're prioritizing. Does that make sense, Corey?
Yeah, I guess I'm just sort of still stuck on this building operations question you added. And if it's not in our budget on the revenue side, I just don't understand how it's going to reconcile without that discrepancy. Unless I artificially stick it in the revenue side, but it's not really in our budget.
Gotcha. Okay. Let me these are good. Let me dig into this and I will get back to whatever I come up with, whatever we can kind of clarify, but we'll come back to you with something on that, because that is a valid concern. And we don't want if it seems like it's going to be problematic, we can think about how this applies to places where it's not in the budget.
Great,
so thank you. Okay, so that's it for chat. Oh, thank you. These are a great question. Okay, Jeanette asks, I'm going to hop ahead to the earlier part of the report. Actually, I'm going to repeat a couple of things from sort of warnings. Sorry. Important notes. Okay. So Jeanette asks, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Windows, what will work this year? Yes. So that is a good question. So browsers, in our experience, and this is what the vendor also tells us, for the survey tool, Google Chrome and recent versions of Microsoft Edge, if those are available, seem to work the best. They seem to have the fewest quirks, typically. In both cases, having a recent version is also good, so you want to make sure that it's semi-up-to-date. Firefox, in our experience, typically works, but can sometimes have a little bit of weirdness. So if Chrome or Edge are available, they would be my first choice. Safari, also like Firefox, should work, but I think also has quirks. So if you're on Mac, your options may be somewhat limited. And then if for some reason you have old versions of Microsoft Edge, I'm not sure why you would, or GASP Internet Explorer, I would definitely not use those. Along those lines, I will say sometimes weird things happen in the survey tool. You will go in and it'll bounce you out for some reason, or you will go in and something weird will happen. I would reach out to me whenever you get any hiccups like that. If anything weird happens in the survey tool, definitely reach out rather than, I mean, you can try to close out and come in again or close out and try another browser. But I wouldn't don't spend an hour and a half hitting your head against the wall and then reach out. Just reach out and we will get it. And worst case, we'll pull in the vendor and have them help. Occasionally, yeah, it mostly works pretty well, except occasionally it doesn't. And occasionally, particularly on certain browsers or just sometimes it will hiccup. And then every once in a while, there's just an outage where the whole thing is down, but you'll figure it out pretty quick because it just won't do anything. But yes, if Chrome is available, I would start with that. That's the one that the vendor says is the most Chrome, or the new versions of Edge, which are basically Chrome. That's what the vendor likes. Other reminders about the report, important safety tips, basically. One person at a time. I would avoid having it open for two people at the same time. I would also avoid having two tabs open of the site at the same time, because every time that you go forward or backward, it saves, and it's very easy to overwrite yourself. So I would avoid doing that if at all costs. And that includes having me. I shouldn't be in your site while you're working on it, because it's very easy to just blank out a page while you do that. So I would avoid that. Second thing, browser buttons. I would avoid using the forward and back browser buttons. There is a next and previous in the survey that you can use that works great. When you do that, it automatically saves every time you go next and previous. There's a sidebar on the left that gives all the pages. You can move around either of those ways. I would not use forward or back in the browser because it doesn't automatically save. It's easy to lose data. It's also easy to just have it. It tends to behave weirdly when you do that. So I would not. So try to get out of the habit of doing that. It can take a little bit of getting used to, but let's see. Paula asks, the survey is not yet open. Correct. That is true. We are. It's in the vendor's hands. As soon as the vendor either tells us when it's going to launch or launches it, we will let everybody know. My thinking at this point is that it's probably going to open in early February and run until March, but we'll give some clarification on that once we get to it. Once it's available. You'll know as soon as we know. Let's see. I had another. So if you need to print out your survey, you can. I think that the PDF option has been not working for a couple of years. It looks like it maybe is working now, but if you always feel free to just get in touch with me and I can turn it into a PDF and send it your way for this year or any previous year. One other thing I will remind everybody about is that there is there's a button up in the corner that says show last year's answers. I would always have that going. I think you are always better off with that data. It gives you an idea of what you answered, so you'll kind of know how it was structured. You'll know if you were like a magnitude off from last year. That means one of them is probably wrong, but around the pandemic, maybe not. It just gives you a better handle on how you're trying to answer. Let's see, other questions, either in the chat or out loud. Let's see, I'm just trying to make sure there wasn't any other important points that I was getting here for. You all know all this stuff. Oh, I will just repeat the reporting period one. I think that folks generally know this, but the reporting period is potentially the most confusing part of the report. It is the last fiscal year that ended before October 15th. So what that means is if you are a July to June of the next year fiscal year library, you just do the most recent one. That's really straightforward. If you are a calendar year, January to December library, you typically are intended to do last year's. So in this case, 2021. However, there are some libraries who are off schedule, who just at some point entered the most recent one. So if you're in that camp, we would like you to reach out to me, and because you have some options. But if you repeat the same year, it makes the report very confusing. So we want to make sure that you're not doing that. If you have any questions about your reporting period, reach out and we can figure that out. Other questions that people might have?
Josh, this is Debbie Roeder again.
Hi, Deb.
Back to the staffing question. We have a pretty healthy substitute budget, and during the past fiscal year, the fiscal year we're reporting on this year, we had a high school student who was taking a gap year before going to college. She had just graduated, and we actually had her working about 20 hours a week pretty regularly, but she wasn't getting benefits and, you know, that kind of thing from the town. She was technically a substitute. Do we add her in as, I mean, she's not technically a permanent staff person, but even this year we've been using regular substitutes each morning for 2 hours a week, every morning, so 10 hours a week at the circ desk. And they also are not permanent employees, they're not getting benefits and so forth. There's no specific job description or anything like that.
Gotcha. Okay, so I think that my dividing line is that the person is generally there every week for the majority of the year. Not a person, but the person. So if you have a sort of rotating cast of subs who fill a spot, I would not include that. If your person who was in 20 hours a week for, it sounds like, a large chunk of the year, I think that might be worth including. But what we're really looking for is somebody who is there almost every week for the period. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for asking that. And that's a new one. So we certainly will, if it seems like it's not answering, like if it seems like it's presenting a conundrum for you and it might regularly, let us know and we can think about ways to finesse that question. Any other questions that people have? Well, I super appreciate everybody making time for this today, and I appreciate all your questions. You have a lot of good ones, that some of which we're going to have to hash out, and we will get back to you on sort of clarifying the difference for your particular case. I also really appreciate the work that you all put into the report. I know it's a lot, and I know that you have a lot of other things that take more than all your time, so we appreciate that you are willing to do it. And again, the last real takeaway is, please get in touch with me if you have any questions at any point. Don't feel bad ever. Whatever the question is, I want to hear it, and I'm happy to be here. So thanks, everyone. I'm going to turn off the recording, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day and a